Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 10 of the Access Circle. First of all, just like always, before we get into the chapter, let's first talk about the objective of the chapter. Now, this chapter is going to be all about mindset frameworks and trading psychology, which is, in my opinion, one of the most, if not the most important parts of trading. Okay, in this chapter, I'll be giving you a full and complete framework for building the right trading mindset. Okay, and this framework will completely reshape and rewire your trading psychology and make it optimal relative to your trading style. Okay, and by the end of this chapter you'll know exactly how to think like a professional trader. You'll know exactly what is the sort of and the type of mindset and the type of psychology that it takes to be profitable. You'll know exactly how to regulate, or you could say control, your emotions before it influences your decisions, or before it messes up with your edge, or before it destroys your edge. And then last but not least, you'll know exactly how to build the mental strength, the patience, and the execution discipline that is required in order to become not just a profitable trader but a consistently profitable trader. Okay, by the end of this chapter, you'll have a complete framework that guides you through all of those different elements and those different aspects of your trading mindset. Okay, now the simple reason all of this matters is because your trading system, your technical side of your system gives you an edge, but your mindset is what actually decides whether you'll ever actually see that edge play out or not. Okay, the simple reason all of this matters is because you could technically have the best trading system in the world, but if your psychology, if your mindset isn't optimal, okay, if your mindset isn't right or correctly aligned with your trading style, then you'll never see that edge play out because you'll keep sabotaging it yourself. Okay, that is why having the correct mindsets and the correct trading psychology is so important. Okay, and this chapter will provide you with all of the tools and all of the guidance to actually make your mindset optimal in your trading psychology aligned with your trading. Okay, now let's get into the chapter. First of all, right here, you can see that I've divided the whole mindset framework into four key components. Okay, it's actually four. Now, these are the four key components that makes up the whole mindset framework. Okay, these components work together to create emotional control and to create long-term consistency as a result of that emotional control. Okay, the first component that we have is identity framework, which basically means how you see yourself as a trader and what is your identity as a trader. Okay, and then after that we have emotional regulation, which is basically managing your internal state or managing your emotions in live market conditions under pressure. Okay, after that we have cognitive framework, which is all about changing how you think about trading, or basically reshaping or rewiring how you think um, about trading. Okay, simple as that. And after that we finally have patience and discipline, which honestly I don't even have to elaborate for you as to how important they are. Okay, these are the different uh, key elements or core components that make up the whole mindset framework. Okay, now first of all, let's start with the identity framework. So identity framework is probably the most foundational component or the most foundational piece in this entire framework. Within this component or within this framework, what you would do or what you want to do here is basically sit down and actually write down what type of trader you are. Okay, in your own words, you're going to write down what type of trader you are and then write down your strengths and weaknesses as a trader. Okay, you're going to write down your strengths and weaknesses. For example, you're going to ask yourself, whether how you act or how you behave under pressure, how well you are with sticking to your stop loss, and other questions like how well you are with letting price play out, how good you are with waiting for your setups, waiting for your confirmations and your entry triggers, and so many more questions like that. Okay, and the key element here is that you have to be honest with yourself, and then by honestly answering these questions, you'll be able to categorize each behavior into either your strengths or your weaknesses. Okay, and once you've actually written them down, you'll then actually be aware of them and they won't be vague. And that way you could then actually deal with those weaknesses, manage those weak behaviors and cope with them, instead of not being aware of them and letting them quietly destroy and ruin your whole edge in your execution. Okay, that is why uh, being aware of your identity framework is so important. It is important because your identity basically sets your behavior, and then those behaviors drives your action. Okay, as a result of those behaviors, you perform certain types of actions, and then those actions shape your results. Okay, now that being said, if your identity is unclear, it's mismatched and it's not optimal and it's unstable, then your behavior will be the same. And then that inconsistent behavior, that inconsistent identity will lead to inconsistent execution and inconsistent results. Okay, that is why this identity framework is so significant and so important. Now, another thing that I'll tell you is that the same identity framework, the same identity also defines your tolerance levels, okay, such as your risk tolerance, your stress tolerance, your emotional, your drawdown tolerance, your uncertainty tolerance, your waiting tolerance. It defines all of these different elements as well. For example, if your identity, if your behavior cannot tolerate waiting, cannot tolerate waiting for your setups, then your trading style cannot be that of a high time frame trader, because your identity and your behavior cannot tolerate waiting for long periods of time. And because you are self aware of that identity, you will not force a high time frame trading style on yourself. Okay, similarly, if your identity cannot tolerate chaos, if your identity cannot handle pressure, cannot handle stress, then you can never become a scalper. You can never have a scalping trading style, because you know scalping requires a lot of stress management and it requires being able to tolerate a lot of stress. And because of that, in that case, you cannot you will not force a scalping style on yourself. Instead, you will be more suited for a day trading style or a swing trading style. Okay, similarly, if your identity gets stressed from large drawdowns, then you wouldn't trade strategies or you wouldn't trade such models that require wide stop losses. Okay, and all of this is just as important as the technical part of your trading system. Okay, in summary, your identity tells you, your identity framework tells you what suits you, what doesn't suit you, what will feel natural, and what will always feel like a fight. And consistency comes from operating when things feel natural. Okay, and the only way you will find that natural, you will feel that natural aspect, is if you are aware of it, you are conscious of it, and it's not hidden. Okay, that is your whole identity framework. and the rest of the mindset frameworks will be built around this identity of yours. Okay, now let's move on to the second component. So the second component that we have is emotional regulation. Now, first of all, let me define what this term means, and then I'll show you how to actually use it or do it in lab market conditions. So basically, emotional regulation is your ability to notice your emotion, notice your emotional state, and then it's your ability to pause and process that emotional state and then return to trading with control over that emotion rather than being impulsive. Okay, that is what I call emotional regulation. Basically, it's the difference between reacting to your emotion automatically on impulse and responding to each behavior, responding to each emotion or each emotional state intentionally with a proper thought process. Okay, that is what emotional regulation is. Okay, now remember, emotional regulation isn't about suppressing your emotion. And the reason I say that is because I think you cannot suppress your emotion. Because if you do, that only leads to even more chaos. Okay, so you cannot suppress your emotion. Instead, emotional regulation, just as the name suggests, is about regulating your emotions, managing your emotions, or you could say handling your emotions with the correct approach and actually dealing with them by being aware of them. Okay, it's not about eliminating your emotions, but rather about preventing those emotions from influencing or dictating, not dictating, dictating your actions or your decisions. Okay, that is what emotional regulation is. Now, let's understand and let's see exactly how we could do that. So, right here, I've made this step-by-step framework for myself, which I use to regulate my emotions. The first step is obviously awareness, which means catching the emotion or recognizing the emotion or basically recognizing the emotional state that you're in. It's basically saying to yourself that, okay, now I'm feeling anxious or maybe I'm feeling frustrated because I lost a trade, or maybe it's saying to yourself that I want to force this trade even though it's an invalid trade because maybe I missed a move. Okay, it's literally saying to yourself these things when they start originating, and you just have to label the emotion, and basically that's awareness. Okay, and once you've formed this awareness and you've recognized the weak behavior or the emotional state, then after that, the second step is what I call the window, which basically means taking a step back after recognizing the emotion or the emotional state. Okay, after catching the emotion, after recognizing the emotion, you create a small window, basically a pause between what you feel and what you actually do, meaning that you create a window or a space between emotion and action. Now, this window can either be 10 seconds long or 20 seconds, or maybe it could be 2 minutes, but the important thing is that it must exist. This window or this gap or this pause must exist. And this window right here is the gap that stops emotions, that stop that weak behavior from hijacking your execution or from hijacking your decision making process. That is the second step, which is basically you create or establish a pause, a window, a small window between your emotion and your action. Okay. And then after that, we have the third step, which is the intervention, which is where you actively interrupt that behavior, interrupt that emotion and that emotional state. And this part, you, during the window, during the pause, use certain tools or certain methods or mechanisms to neutralize that destructive emotion. And it could look something like drinking water, stepping away from your computer, your laptop, or your setup, and reminding yourself of your identity, reminding yourself of your weaknesses, and most importantly, reminding yourself of what it actually takes to be a successful and profitable trader. In this step, you basically interrupt that behavior or that emotional state by using one of these mechanisms, by using one of these methods. Okay, it could also include something like reminding yourself of the previous losses that you had, which resulted due to you not interrupting that behavior or due to you not intervening when that behavior originated. Okay, now this part could be different for every trader. This part could be different for each one of you. Okay, now personally for me, when I recognize in a weak behavior or an emotion, what I do is I basically step away from the charts, drink some water, do some push-ups, and that basically neutralizes the emotion for me actually. Okay, and in the same way, you'll do whatever you find best, which could neutralize the emotion. Okay, intervention is basically you breaking that emotional cycle before it turns into a mistake or before it actually influences your actions. Now, a real example of intervention in live market condition or live market could look something like, let's say you missed a setup by 2 pips. Okay, you were waiting for a setup all day and then you got a setup, you got your confirmations, you got your entry triggers, but then you missed that setup by, let's say, 2 pips. And because of missing that setup, you start feeling FOMO. Your brain starts telling you that now you have to get in, otherwise the move is happening without you and you're going to miss the move. And in that particular scenario, what you would do is, first of all, recognize that emotion, recognize that weak behavior, which basically means that you'll build awareness by telling yourself that, okay, I'm feeling FOMO right now because I missed a setup. I'm feeling like I'm missing out and I might enter a trade late because of that. You're just going to tell yourself that. And that basically establishes awareness. Okay, in that scenario, by telling yourself that, you build awareness. Okay, and now that you've built that awareness, what you would do is you would create a small window or you would pause. Okay, you would take a step back from the charts and you would pause. Okay, you would create a gap between that emotion and taking a decision or making a decision. And during that pause, during that gap, during that window, you will intervene. You will interrupt that behavior, you will interrupt that emotion of FOMO by taking a step back from the charts, drinking some water, reminding yourself of what it actually takes to be a profitable trader, reminding yourself that if I jump in late, then that means I break my model and that's not me. Okay? You will do all of these things during the intervention step. And by doing all of this, by interrupting that behavior and having these mechanisms in place, by the time you look back, the emotion would be gone, the impulse would be gone, and the emotion would be processed instead of being acted upon. And that way, in that particular scenario, you would keep your consistency intact instead of hijacking your execution, or instead of letting that emotion hijack your decision making process. Okay, and that is an example of emotional regulation. Okay, and then after that, once that emotion has been processed properly, you then reset, which basically means that you come back to the charts with your thoughts clear, your decision making neutral, and you no longer trying to fix something or trying to act upon your emotions. Okay, you return to your charts with baseline clarity. Okay, that is the fourth step of emotional regulation. And that way, you never act upon your emotion, and instead of suppressing it by ignoring it, you regulate it by using this proper framework, using this proper approach or this method. Okay, that's the exact framework you have to use if you want to regulate your emotions. Okay, now along with that, what you need to remember and what you need to know and understand is that emotional regulation is first physiological before it's psychological. And the reason I say that is because sometimes we fail to recognize and notice that our body is what actually influences our emotions. We fail to notice and we fail to understand that emotions actually comes from our body first. What that means is that if your physiological state is trash or it is poor, then obviously your psychology would also be poor as a result. Okay? If your sleep is poor, if your hydration is poor, if your diet is shit, and you haven't moved all day, you have no physical activity, then your emotional regulation doesn't stand a chance. Because if your body is shit, then your mind is also going to be shit. Okay, it's just as simple as that, and that's a reality you cannot ignore. And that's why I always say that the foundational part of emotional regulation or your trading psychology is physical too. Okay, you need to understand and remember that. So that was the second component of the mindset framework. And now let's move on to the next slide and let's discuss the third component, which is a cognitive framework. Now, the way I would define this term, cognitive framework, is that it's the actual mental lens or psychological lens you are seeing the market through. It's the actual mental lens you are seeing trading through. It's the thoughts you have, the stories you tell yourself, the assumptions that you make, or the interpretations that you have. All of that, all of those things, all of those different elements make up your cognitive framework. And the thing is that most traders have no clue that they even have one. It's just running in the background like an invisible operating system. And because it's invisible, it ends up controlling everything and you don't even question it. Okay, now the reason this is such a big deal and the reason this matters so much is because your cognitive framework is basically the filter or the lens that shapes how you perceive what's happening on the screen. It's the filter that shapes how you perceive each trading decision, each behavior. Okay, for example, two traders can have the same trading system, they can have the same entry model, the same technical system, but still there's going to be a difference between their performance. One of them may be consistently losing and then the other one might be winning consistently. Now the difference here isn't in their system or in their edge. In fact, they're actually both the same. Instead, the difference is in their mindset. The difference is in their thoughts. The difference is in their interpretations of different mental concepts. For example, one of the trader think in terms of probabilities, while the other trader think in certainties. And because of that pattern of thinking, the prior student, not student, the prior trader, the prior one isn't attached to the outcomes of individual trades, but rather he focuses on following his system, following his process. But the latter one, because of thinking in certainties, because of that pattern of thinking, he gets attached to every single individual trade, due to which he gets emotional with every trade. Okay, that second trader, because of thinking in certainties, with every win he gets excited and with every loss he starts panicking, and due to which his performance is not good as the other one, even though they have they have the same type of edge, the same system. Okay, so basically the difference is in their cognitive frameworks. Okay, now what we're going to do in this slide is we will build awareness of that framework, that cognitive framework. We will become conscious of it, become self-aware of it, and then that way we can actually change it. Okay, now what I mean by changing that cognitive framework is that we will remove the distortions that comes from fear, greed, attachment to outcomes, or perfectionism, or ego. Okay, all of those things, all of those different negative aspects mess with our perception and twist the way how we think about trading and the way we read price action. Okay, and if we change those patterns and remove those distortions that come from those negative aspects like perfectionism or ego, then we will change the way how we think about trading. We will change the way how we define what good trading actually is. And that way our performance will start to improve. That way our performance will resonate with the same frequency as our technical edge, as our theoretical technical edge. Now, one way I like to frame this whole concept of cognitive framework is that your system gives you the technical lens, but your cognitive framework gives you the mental clarity to actually trust what you're seeing. And that clarity only comes when you stop projecting your insecurities onto the market. What that means is that if you are carrying the need to be right, then you'll start executing setups that are not valid just to prove a point, just to prove that you are doing enough, just to prove that you are right. And obviously that never ends up working. Similarly, if you are chasing after missed profits, if you are chasing after a missed expansion or a missed move, then because of that, you'll start jumping into trades too early. Similarly, if you've attached your ego to individual trades, then because of that, you'll be afraid of losing trades. And then that way, you'll hesitate and you'll second guess your decisions even when a clean setup appears, even when a valid setup appears. And that way you'll start second guessing your system, you'll start doubting yourself, doubting your trading plan, and you'll start to avoid taking valid trades because apparently you lost a trade yesterday, and now, and because you've attached your ego to that, you don't want to lose again even today. And even though the reality is that yesterday's loss hasn't got anything to do with today's trade, this new trade, it's not going to affect or impact the outcome of this trade. You avoid taking it, you start hesitating because of your ego, because of how you think, because of your cognitive framework. Okay, and the only way to solve that problem is by changing your cognitive framework and start applying these principles that I've written down right here, and start adding it to your own framework and start thinking in that sort of way and that sort of manner. Okay, now the first principle that we've got is understanding that outcomes are random, but your process isn't. And when you internalize this principle, your focus naturally shifts from trying to predict every outcome to just executing your process. Now, this is one of the hardest pills to swallow in trading, and that's because everyone wants control. Everyone wants certainty, and that's because that's how we've been brought up. That's the thinking patterns that we've been taught throughout our whole life. But the truth in trading is that you can do everything right. You can have the perfect market context and the trade could be aligned with the high time frame bias. You could have the perfect timing for your entry and you might still lose a trade. Now, when you lose that trade, that's not a failure, that's not an error. That's just randomness playing out. Okay? The truth is that the market doesn't owe you a winning trade just because you followed your plan. And that's because trading is probabilistic and it's random and there's no certainty involved. Okay? On the other hand, that randomness does not apply to your process. Okay? That randomness does not apply to your preparation, to your analysis, to your execution, to your journaling, to your routines. Okay? Those are the things that can be controlled with intention. And because of that, because of the fact that you can control those things, the only thing that is worth measuring and that is worth improving is how consistently you follow your process, how consistently you do those things, how consistently you journal, how consistently you execute. And that's where your edge lies. Okay, not in predicting the outcome, but in executing your plan, executing your system, executing your process with precision and accuracy, regardless of the outcome. Okay, this is the first principle that you have to internalize and add to your cognitive framework. The second principle that we have is trading for statistical consistency rather than validation. And that's obviously the entire essence of professional trading. Okay, when you follow the principle, the above principle, then that directly leads to thinking in this sort of manner, which is trading and executing for statistical consistency, meaning probabilities, rather than validation, rather than trying to prove that you are right, rather than trying to prove that you are doing enough. And because of that, what ends up happening is that you start to overtrade, you start taking invalid trades because you want validation, because you want to be right, because you want to be correct, rather than just following your plan and letting your edge play out. Okay, so that's the second principle. The third one is thinking in probabilities and expectancies rather than individual outcomes. Now, this is where the actual mental shift happens. When you start applying this principle right here, what ends up happening is that you stop looking at trades as wins or losses. Instead, you start seeing them as small data points in a large probability distribution. Okay, and because of that, you start acknowledging the fact that you cannot control outcomes, and the only thing you can control is your sample size of data. The only thing you can control is how many quality setups you take, how many valid setups you take, how many valid trades you take or execute. And that completely shifts your mindset. Okay, when you understand that your edge only expresses itself over a large enough sample size of data, your mindset shifts. Okay, when you understand that one bad day, one bad trade, or one loss, or one bad week does not define your edge, your mindset shifts and your performance starts improving. Okay, and then the fourth principle that we have is to treat both wins and losses the same. Okay, and this is basically the key to emotional neutrality. Okay, I don't have to explain this one. Okay, so basically these were the four principles that you must add to your cognitive framework or to your mental framework or to the way how you think about trading, and that will completely redefine what good trading actually means for you, and that will align your mental framework or your patterns of thinking to a much more optimal state that positively which positively influences your decision making process and your trading ability, and that will directly lead to better trading performance. And then after that we have the fourth component of the mindset framework, which is discipline and patience. And again, I don't have to explain these two to you to show you how important they are, because I know you already know how important and significant they are. It's just a matter of actually adding these two key elements and these two key aspects to your behavior and to your routine. Okay,